you. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the August 2024 Cost Growth Target Tag meeting. I put this in the chat and mentioned it earlier, but in case you missed it, please look and see if your name has your affiliated organization. And if it doesn't, um, please edit that so we have an idea of who's here. This also helps us keep track of questions in the chat so we know if it's what organization it's coming from, if you're a payer or provider entity. Thank you so much. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. We are slated, this is one of our larger 2-hour meetings. I'm not sure we'll take the whole time, but we do have a little bit of space at the end in case there are technical staff from payer organizations, so they could ask us some questions because that CGT1 file is due in a little over a week, not this Friday, next Friday. All right, so this is the agenda. We'll do the same program updates, and then like previous years, we will give an overview of what the data validation process looks like for payers. Again, this is for the CGT1 file that is only submitted by payer organizations. And we'll explicitly talk about the CGT1 file and name it because our next agenda item is talking about a new data file our program is ingesting. We call it the CGT4 file. It is a new frontline worker compensation data, and we are collecting those files for the first time this year. And the only data reporters for that file are mid and large sized provider organizations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the meeting. And then we have our wrap up. And as I mentioned verbally before, we'll have some space for any Q&A if there are technical staff from payer organizations working on compiling that CGT1 file. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we're gonna run through some program updates now. Next slide. Okay, so some updates from the advisory committee. All materials for that committee are posted online on their own advisory committee webpage. The link is provided for you there. In brief, the committee met in July and heard a presentation from OHA staff on cost growth drivers. These are drivers that were identified using the CGT data, the most recent CGT data. That report is also online if you want to take a peek at that. After that cost drivers conversation, advisory committee members then held a discussion on a whole suite of strategies and tools payers and provider organizations currently employ or could employ or scale up to control cost growth. That was a really interesting conversation, and a lot of people brought many things to the table. So if you'd like to view that, the recording is available online. The committee did not meet in August. Their next meeting is right there, September 24th, and slides, meeting materials will be posted as that date gets closer. Next slide, please. Rulemaking update. Every month, a rulemaking update. This was a big rulemaking year. Many of you will remember we had a lot of rulemaking activity earlier this year. I believe 5 RAC meetings, Rules Advisory Committee meetings to develop and finalize the accountability rules for this program. So those rules were finalized officially in July 22nd. So they're now incorporated in our cost growth target Oregon administrative rules. If you want to see the final rules, the link is there to the Secretary of State webpage. If you would like to see other materials, documents related to the rulemaking process, those are all posted online on the accountability webpage there. Next slide. Okay, so there is no cost growth target advisory committee meeting this month, but we also still had an educational webinar. I believe the recording is online, but that August 8th webinar was an overview of hospital payment report data and dashboards. The next educational webinar is September 23rd, and that will be an overview on accountability. So if you've been getting little bits of information, dipping in and out on what all's been happening with accountability for this program, that would be a really good webinar to attend just to get the most up-to-date information on that. The webinar slides and recordings for all these educational webinars are on the advisory committee website right there. Next slide. Okay, here is somewhat payer staff have already been notified, but here is a somewhat last minute update to the CGT1 data template. So last week we updated the template to accommodate some new information, and this is particularly relevant for CCO payer data organizations. Well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I guess the first update was there was a formatting error with one of the cells, the non-claims recovery column. Essentially, you would input a correct number value format, and people were getting an error, a red cell highlight, which means you entered incorrect data. That is corrected now. The next update is about that CCO specific data, CCOF dental dollars. Let's go to the next slide to see some more details about that. All right, so all CCO payer contacts have been emailed and aware of this, but we want to highlight this here for everybody who attends TAG. New in calendar year 2023 are CCOF dental dollars. We apologize for not incorporating this information in the CGT1, but in short, this is spending for dental that we do want to capture for CCO payers. And you can see here, to avoid double counting member months and erroneously attributing dental dollars to a PCP, that new CGT1 spreadsheet that is posted online and was emailed out to payer staff, it now accepts a new line of business code 7. That line of business code 7 is only for Medicaid CCOF dental dollars, and it is only to be reported in the TME all tab, so not the unattributed or the attributed tab. There are some more details on CCOF duals expenses. Briefly, you can report them in line of business 7. I want to stop here and see if there are any questions from people on the line. If you have any questions, or if CCO staff have concerns about being able to meet that September 6th deadline next Friday, please let us know. And if you have, I don't know if I said this already, but if you have any questions, you could always email us and we'll respond as quickly as we can. All right. Well, thanks for that. Let's go to the next slide, Kay. Okay. Let's get into the data validation process for the CGT1 file this year. Next slide. So in short, there is no process change from last year. Last year, I think we did a pretty good job of pre-scheduling people for data validation meetings, so we could quickly line up all of our schedules, and kind of left it to, whether that data meeting was to discuss data reporting issues, or if we were having that, that what we call the stage 3 data finalization conversation. So we're going to continue that this year. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a little workflow of how that happens. As you can see, starting in the upper left, the payers submit the file, and then we do file validation in-house in OHA. This little node, file validation with payers, I'll blow that up in a next slide so you could see all of what that entails. But if you look, there's 2 green shapes and then 2 purple shapes. That's just to denote that we do 2 parallel tracks of data validation. The green track is for payers. So what we do, like in the previous 3 years, is we validate every single payer file we receive, which I believe is about 40. So we validate all of those, and we must validate all of those before we could make the statewide file. Once that statewide file is assembled, then we are able to make the provider organization list. We see what provider organizations have enough member months to be included in our program as an accountable provider organization. Once we have that list, we can make provider organization data summaries, which we then share with provider organizations, meet with them to validate that data. So that is data validation. Data validation, we started that with the previous data validation conversations, but again, this year we're going to keep that data validation separate from the cost drivers / reasonableness conversation. So you can see in the later gray shapes, those arrows are all things to do further down the line related to reasonableness of cost drivers. The first thing, and it's very important for us to do, is just to validate the data and make sure it makes sense. And then you can see what all happens here, file validation for payers. Let's go to the next slide. So file validation actually starts before we even get the file from payers. The first row on the top of this slide, these are payer staff self-checks you can do before you give us the file. So in the CGT1 data training webinar, we go through, and you can see in the slides, it walks you through those data validation tabs at the bottom of the workbook. These skim the template for any formatting issues, any missing values, provider organization names that don't quite match up between multiple tabs, things like that. Because if those checks are failed, that's an automatic kickback from us to you, and we will have to go through like a resubmission process. So there are checks the payers staff can do, and I know a lot of you do, before you submit us the CGT1 file. Once you submit the CGT1 file to our inbox, our staff run what we call stage 2 data checks, and those are the you could see those in sort of like the middle rows of rectangles there. At that point, we already have a data validation meeting on the books. So if all goes well, if all those stage 2 checks go well, we meet with you, we talk about any any remaining concerns, we have you look at the summary output we create and make sure it makes sense with what you understand with your organization. And then if that's all good, then the file is accepted and we move it to the finalized file corral on our way to a statewide data file. If in that meeting, we see something that looks a little suspicious, that's an opportunity for us to go back, our team and or your team, to make sure that the data are correct. And if a resubmission is needed, we will definitely want to do that. So, and that has happened at stage 3 finalization meetings, which is totally fine because we definitely want good data in order to feed the statewide file. Any questions with this? So when I guess I'll also add, when you get an email from our staff, most likely Tiffany, for scheduling those data validation meetings, please answer them as soon as you can and provide your team's availability so we can get those meeting schedules. I know we have a lot of meetings already scheduled, but I believe not everyone has been scheduled yet. Any questions? I think the timeline is on the next slide. So let's go. Yeah, so this is the timeline. So we get the CGT1 file in early September. We do file validation. We've been able to compress that validation time. I know a lot of you were here the first year and it took a couple months, more than a couple months, to validate all the files. It was, everybody's first time doing it and compiling everything. We've all learned a lot and we can, I think, hopefully get it so that we have a statewide file by December. But this timeline can move, but this is what our tentative timeline looks like. So we have data validation meetings with payers September, October, maybe a little bit in November, but hopefully we will finish validating all the files sometime in November so we could have a statewide file in December. We do want to give the provider organizations their data summary as soon as we can. So this year that might look like we send out summaries in January, maybe early January to have data review meetings with provider organizations in the first 2-3 months of the year. And then reasonableness meetings will happen on a rolling basis after that. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm a payer, do I have to wait until February 2025 to have a reasonableness meeting if my organization was above the target for a market? And the answer is no, you don't. I think we're envisioning that cost drivers, reasonableness meetings, they'll happen for an organization as soon as we can to kind of like move up our timeline. I know we're still having some reasonableness meetings right now, this being the first year we're doing it. So, it's been a little bit delayed, but we're going to try to tighten that timeline. But this is just an overview of the validation conversation, so I don't want us to get like hung up on that. Are there any questions? And if there's folks on my side that see chat questions, please pipe up because I can't see the chat right now. All right, we could save all the accountability questions too for the webinar. but hopefully the validation, the CGT1 file validation process timeline kind of makes sense. We're not straying too much from last year, except that we're hoping to shorten that time. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, validation meetings, CGT1 file validation meetings. So this is just kind of a reiterating the timeline from the previous slide. So this fall, we're going to have online payer validation. Fingers crossed we'll have that statewide file in November or December, so we can have those provider organization data conversations early 2025. You'll see there's a note at the end, validation may take one or more meetings. We hope it only takes one meeting. Of course, everybody does, but it is okay if it takes more meetings. We're always, you know, aiming to get good data. So just be aware this timeline is a little flexible. This is also very dependent on staff availability. We do as much back and forth via email as we can, but sometimes, as you all know, it's a lot easier to hash out any data issues just talking, face to face with someone. So be ready to have your team ready to schedule those data validation meetings. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, well, I'll hold here. Are there any CGT1 file data questions, data validation questions?
This is Blaine West from Neighborhood Health.
Hi, Blaine.
I put in the chat, but you weren't able to see it, so I just wanted to confirm on slides 11 and 13.
Okay, yeah, Kay, can we go back to those slides?
I know that it's the box noted there, notice of exceeding the target.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to clarify, I know the CGT1 is specific to payers, but I was wondering when it says notice of exceeding the target, if that would be a notice to both payers and providers or just payers?
Oh, so that is for both. The data summaries for payers are assembled and they're ready, much earlier than for provider organizations. Like we have those data summaries in the fall, and if the file is finalized, that's the final data summary. So notice of exceeding the target, I think so. Payers will likely get those a little earlier than provider organizations, and we'll be doing reasonableness conversations. Maybe we might be doing reasonableness conversations with a payer, in January at the same time we're doing it for, say, a provider organization. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of, but we're trying to tighten that timeline so we don't have to drag it as long as as necessary. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Anything else from other people? Okay, I think let's go to the CGT4 overview. And this is just this is an overview. It's a pretty small template, at least small, like, number of tabs. I do want to add, there is going to be a recorded webinar posted in the next week or so. So this summary of the CGT4 is just to give everybody a little bit of the background and a taste of what it looks like. But also know that there is a webinar planned later. Let's go to the next couple slides, Kay. The next topic was CGT4 overview, I believe. Yeah, okay. And then next slide. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So all of the provider entities that are CGT4 data reporters have been contacted this year. So hopefully this is not super new information for anybody on the call. But we do know that some people have been keeping closer tabs on this work than others. So we do want to give a little bit of a background. Oh, before I get into the background, I believe it looks like there is no general chat. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then that would and then I believe everybody can see that, and then we'll just take questions that way. Thanks, Tiffany. Okay, so frontline workforce compensation, where did this come from? So when this program was stood up, a lot of the design of it was born out of the first advisory committee, actually the implementation committee. In 2021, they started their recommendations and started an initial list of potential factors in anticipation of accountability work. So that was 2021. In 2022, the superseding governance committee, the advisory committee, added macroeconomic factors as a potential acceptable reason an accountable entity maybe exceeded the cost growth target. So that was 2022. Coming out of COVID, I think we all can remember, we don't want to remember, but definitely can remember how disruptive, hectic the economy was back then, inflation, and all of that, all of what that wrought on the healthcare system. So they added this new macroeconomic factors to the list. I'll also note that list of potentially acceptable reasons, it's not a finite list. It was never meant to be a finite list, because as we know, big things, surprising things can happen all the time. So we just want to, just wanted to note that. In that macroeconomic factors detail, pay increases for frontline workforce was included as an example. In 2023 legislative session, there was a House Bill 2045 that specified that a provider entity should not be accountable for cost growth target or cost growth resulting from total compensation provided to frontline workers. I think, knowing that frontline workforce was an acceptable reason, and with the passage of this bill, we did have frontline workforce as a future optional data submission from provider organizations. But then in rulemaking, in 2024 rulemaking, a lot of discussion back and forth resulted in a new requirement for medium and large size provider organizations. So I know some folks were a little surprised at this, but by having silver lining, by having this be a requirement for provider organizations, I will say it does give the program the opportunity to look at that frontline worker compensation, to basically front load that information, because we're collecting the CGT4 data at the same time we're collecting the CGT1. And hopefully it's not too bulky an administrative lift. I know it is a new lift. It's a data reporting requirement provider organizations did not have to do before, and now they are requiring to do it before. But hopefully we'll walk you through it, and once you see the template, it won't look as scary. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit of intro. So who's required to submit the template? So for this CGT4 template, it is provider organizations. payers submit the CGT1, medium and large size provider organizations submit the CGT4. How we get that list, which will be posted just like we post the payer list. We get that provider entity list using the most recent year of CGT data. And if you actually look at our report released in May of this year, you'll see that we've divided provider organizations into medium and large organizations. Well, and smaller organizations, depending on member months. So those are the entities submitting data this year. And I guess I'll talk about due dates a little bit later. So what is the requirement? It's an Excel workbook. It's called the CGT4 template. It is uploaded onto the provider organization webpage. So the template is linked there. The provider organization webpage itself is also linked. We'll have the recording for the webinar posted there when it's done, and also information about office hours. So what is being collected? So frontline workforce compensation, this is spending such as wages, incentives, benefit expenses. We also collect payroll hours, things like that. That snapshot to the right is a snapshot of the required tab. And if we go to the next page, we will, oh wait, not yet, okay. We want to talk about the submission schedule. So this is go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. This is the submission schedule. So for this year, because we waited until, we had to wait until rulemaking was finalized to broadcast the requirement, what the template looked like, all of those details. We are pushing back the due date to December 6th this year. So for this year, provider entities will have a little bit of time to get their ducks in a row and compile this data for a December 6th due date to us. And this submission will include calendar year workforce compensation spending in 2022 and 2023. In subsequent years, the file is going to be due the first Friday of September. So for next year, that's September 5th, 2025, and then the next year, September 4th. And we'll always have, we're operating this like the CGT1 file, where we have notifications in the spring, so everybody is aware that they are a data reporter for the year, and stuff like that. Blaine, you have a question?
So each of those years we have to resubmit, like for example, 2022, 2023, and the following year we have to resubmit 2023 data and 2024?
Yes. So this kind of follows the convention of the CGT1. If the numbers haven't changed, then the numbers haven't changed and you could input the same numbers. But in case, because the file has things like incentives or something, I think the idea was that we wanted the most complete data, understanding that maybe there might be a little bit of dollars shifting. Hopefully not a lot. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, sorry, excuse me. Okay, so this is a snapshot of all of the tabs in the CGT4 workbook. As you can see, only the first tab, the cover page tab, is technically required. And we'll show you what the contents are for that tab. However, it is high level data. So we want to give the opportunity for entities to provide us a little bit more context, excuse me. The next two tabs are frontline worker. Oh, excuse me, sorry. There is a typo on this page. So tabs 2 and 3 should be frontline worker, current and previous. And that is annual compensation to frontline workers for calendar years 2023 and 2022. Those are optional. Tabs 4 and 5 are non-frontline workers for the current and previous year. And current is 2023 and previous years 2022. The last two tabs are reference tabs. You do not need to fill these out. You can look at them. The annual adjustment is that compensation threshold for reporting. So for this year, I believe that is 200,000, 200K is the threshold. And the last tab is definitions. So there are a couple terms, very familiar terms to you on the cover page for filling out this template. But the tab 7 definitions goes into that a little bit more if you have any questions. I think on the bottom of that tab 2 is space for any questions and answers that we can populate ahead of time. Right now, I believe there's only one in there, but we might update it in the future. Let's go to the next tab. That will show us what the cover page looks like. So this is a snapshot of the cover page. There's other data in here, but it's, items like contact name, and attestation information. But this is basically the meat of what that required covered page looks like. So you can see it's pretty high level information. The required information is total organization expenses for all worker types, not just frontline workers, for 2023 and 2022. And you can see we require operating expense, payroll hours, benefit expense, and total contracted labor expense. More detailed definitions on those terms are in that last tab, the definitions tab. And you can see below that table is another table, and this one is specifically for frontline worker compensation. We want to pause here to see if any folks have questions right now, because we would want to collect those questions to build any upcoming guidance materials. If you don't have any questions right now too, you could always just take this back, look at the template, and email our team.
Is there additional documentation on the website regarding who falls into the worker category, frontline worker categories?
So the only documentation right now is, and I apologize, I don't know this off the top of my head, is the definitions in the last tab. And any details from the OAR itself, the rule itself, defining frontline workforce. You could also take a peek. I think it really depends on the organization, but you could also take a peek at the optional tabs. They break out frontline workforce in a couple different categories. So if you wanted to kind of look at that and adopt that for your, what qualifies as frontline workforce, I think you're free to do that too. And one of the future slides shows a snapshot of that. Let's go ahead. If there's no more questions, I don't think there's any more hands. Let's go to the next slide. And okay, not yet. This is just reiterating for folks, only the cover page tab is required for the CGT4 to be considered complete. However, as noted before, completing those optional tabs does give the program more supporting information. I think especially if you think frontline workforce compensation cost growth was a major factor. Filling in those optional tabs could save time and effort ahead of any potential reasonableness conversations. Oh, and that's not to say that we can't, also collect that data later on. If you only filled in the cover tab, and then if it turned out we had a reasonableness conversation and you wanted to talk about more granular workforce costs, we would of course work with you to get that supplemental information later too. But yeah, if you have the time, staff, and if you know that this is going to be relevant for your organization, we're strongly encouraging people to submit those optional tabs. Next slide. All right, so this is a peek at the optional frontline and non-frontline tabs. So we have those two groups of workers, and then they're further separated into current year and previous year. But just looking at those two groups of workers, to start off, we stratify them by setting, and then worker type, like physicians, nurse, worker types like that. The data input fields, these are the columns running along the template, will ask for information such as person hours, dollar spending for wages, salaries, incentives, bonuses, and then also the dollar amount for benefits for this group of this workforce group. For frontline workers, the input fields are separated for represented and non-represented workers. And as I said before, each year has its own tab. There is a little note at the bottom if you have an employee that works in multiple settings, to include their hours and costs in the setting in which they work the most. So let's go to the next slide, and you'll see a little snapshot of what one of the optional worker data tabs looks like. So you can see there's a setting, clinic workers, and worker type. There's a lot of rows. You could peek at the template and let us know if you have any questions on them. I think maybe a question people might have right now is where to put contract workers. And if you go to the template and scroll down, there is a row for direct contract labor. Yeah, so after the worker type data field, that's where you have all the other, your other data columns that I had just talked about. Person hours, total wages, total benefits, all that good stuff. So please let us know. We are collecting questions for upcoming guidance materials. I'll pause here and see if anybody has any thoughts or comments right now. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Um, I mentioned before you don't have to do anything to these reference slides, but we did just want to show people what it looked like. Um, and if you recognize this number, I believe this number is straight from the House Bill 2045, so it is in statute for this first year. The annual compensation reporting threshold is 200,000, and that will be adjusted annually. Let's go to the next slide. This is a peek at what that reference tab looks like. These are definitions for terms you'll see in this template. If you have any questions, feel free to email us after you have a moment maybe to go over this. All right, next slide. Not seeing any hands. Upcoming resources. So we are going to record a webinar going through the template. It will basically kind of look like what we just did, the overview we just did, but a little more detailed. So that will be coming out in the next week or so. We also, like the CGT1 file, we also want to offer open, free office hours for staff that are completing this template. Those office hours are going to be during tag times, during the September 25th tag and during the October 23rd tab. I think some of you know in previous years, we usually cancel these tags as we are deep in CGT1 payer validation. But the time is on everybody's schedule already. We have the Zoom link all set up, so we are going to repurpose these tag meetings as free-for-all open office hours for those completing the CGT4 file. Tag meeting information is on our webpage. So you could look at the dates and put it on your own calendar. But we do have a calendar meeting series already set up. If you want to get on that and or get on the tag email list, please email us and we can add you to the email list or also this tag meeting series. Next slide. Some might recognize that salamander. That is Tarica granulosa, a common local amphibian of Oregon. Anyways, okay, so that concludes this August tag meeting. Our next tag is in September, so I don't know why that says October, but our next tag is definitely in September. We have office hours at the September and October tab. Sorry for that typo. All right, so that concludes this tag. Kay, you can turn off the recording. Can you share the slides again? I think there is an additional slide. We did want to give payer technical staff an opportunity to ask any questions. Can you go to the next slide? Ask any questions related to the submission of the CGT1 file. So I think we'll hold here a bit to see if people want to get off mute and ask their questions. And if there's no questions in a minute or two, I think we'll call it a day and give people about an hour back. All right, not hearing anything. I don't see any hands raised. I do see people are leaving the meeting. So I think we can consider this tag meeting closed. Thank you all for joining us this Wednesday. As always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please email us. Um, all right, yeah, and I think that concludes our August cost growth target tag.
Thank you, Trey.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.